This rollout, if I understood it, part of it is an edge thing, so they're preparing for edge. I know the definition of edge varies from person to person, but this is, if you like, maybe a regional move before they then get to the really local, whether it's kiosks on the side of the road for autonomous vehicles, whatever that's going to be. And also, am I right in thinking that hyperscalers, I mean, traditionally when they wanted to get in a new market, they'd probably just take some space in a colo and then maybe over time do something. But are they now looking more strategically? So instead of just going the colo route, they are actually building their own data centers in more frequently in more locations.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time, the reason that people would go into colo was because especially let's take Turkey, for example, that is a difficult market to navigate, and it takes a brave person to walk in with a hundreds of millions of euros project, and to have the confidence to pull it off, as opposed to trying to find a local partner. And I think what you're seeing here is a increasing confidence from the hyperscalers that they can self-deliver, and sometimes it's a combination. So we're seeing Amsterdam, the trend is it's not either or, it's not colo or enterprise, it's a combination of both. I think colo provides burst capacity for them, whereas they have their underlying long-term requirements, and I think it's probably a hedge in a certain way that they are kind of combining there. But I certainly think that and it's my advice to anyone, if people are still thinking that they can make high returns like they used to be able to 10 or 15 years ago, when you could do a walk around London and find a patch of land and get an option on it, and then do a pre-let to Microsoft for 100 megawatts, for a 25-year lease, and then go to your funder with a contract both for the option on the land and the space and the power contracts in place. I don't think that really exists anymore. I think if you want to be, I think, looking for better returns now, you have to be more willing to get out into the more regional markets. And I think we're perhaps seeing that there is an increased willingness from funders now to invest in markets that traditionally they would not have looked at, purely because the returns are simply not there if they only go into a very small number of very overheated, not overheated, but very hot markets that your margins are going to be squeezed.
What you're characterizing, was that happening anyway, or was the pandemic? Because I'm thinking, we're clearly, as we're doing now, we're all working from home, or many more people are working from home more frequently. So therefore, instead of millions of people piling into London and data centers being in London, because that's the obvious place to put them, are we already seeing a trend where people are understanding that data centers might be able to be built in towns and cities less centralized, or is that something that maybe will be happening into the future? Or as I say, is that started to happen, do you think?
Yeah, there's this question of to what extent did the pandemic accelerate things, or to what extent were they accelerating on their own? There is no doubt that the pace of development is increasing. I think what the pandemic did was cause a lot of capacity to go from that, what we call the phased status, so they'd committed to it but they hadn't started building, to pushing the button on it very quickly. And there was the Google podcast, I can't remember the name of the series, but they said that there was a 30 times increase in video conferencing traffic. And that's just Google Meet, and very few people use, relatively few people use Google Meet. So if you imagine what Zoom or Teams or something like that, it inevitably is going to result in a substantial increase. I think it's you always get this when you are in times of adversity. It also causes a kind of flourishing of creativity and inventiveness, and we're seeing that with vaccines now. That vaccine research has probably, they were saying, it's been advanced sort of 20 years in this one year, just purely because of the need. And I think what's happened is, in the case of the pandemic, a lot of changes which probably would have happened over a course of 20 years have suddenly accelerated, and people have realized. So, home working, it used to be the joke in the office that, oh yeah, working from home, yeah, are we? Oh yeah, just don't drop your phone in the pool. There was all of that, and now people are realizing that no, this is a genuine viable strategy. And of course, then you have to build out the infrastructure. So I think from a public cloud perspective, I think people are getting very, it's been fantastic for public cloud because it's forced people to get off-prem more quickly. And of course, you have a situation where company servers were all, held in one place. And of course, you have huge problems with latency because they were never expecting to have, 1,000 people logging in on thin clients, Citrix portals or whatever, whatever it is, there just wasn't that expectation. So there was a poll that came out on LinkedIn recently, and I'm not sure whether you saw it, but it said like, what has catalyzed the digital transformation of your business? And you had three choices. It was your CTO, your CEO, or your pandemic. And it was like 4%, 4%, and 92%. So I have no doubt that it has been a factor. But I think what we're seeing is not a temporary thing. I think what this will mean is a long-term change as well in work habits, which will, it'll be beneficial for the planet. I think it'll be beneficial for employees. And I think it's obviously very, very good for the results of the public cloud companies as well.
Yeah, you mentioned good for the planet. Clearly, you got this sort of friction, if you like, that the digital world is here. We're not going to wind back the clock, but it makes huge demands on finite resources, etc. And data centers, they often get compared to the travel sector, which obviously is under the sort of environmental cosh. Data centers similarly. So I know they're all committed to sustainability, whether that's offsetting carbon, using renewables. But how have you done any sort of research as to sort of what's actually going on? And then maybe, to me, we sort of done the easy stuff, and the next one with COP26 is happening. There's an increasing environmental pressure. What is the next step that these organisations have to do to keep, if only in the public's favour, but also obviously to make some meaningful changes as well?
So there is already a commitment to 100% renewables from both Google and Microsoft, and I think they're already carbon neutral. And Amazon has a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2030. The issue that they have, as I understand it, is that a lot of their they were early in the public cloud game, and therefore they have more deployments in traditional data centers with less flexibility. But they're catching up, and they'll be there in 2030. So if you consider as large consumers of power, they are also large consumers of renewable power, and in many cases, the renewable power that they mandate that they must use is not there. So what they become is a catalyst for new renewable schemes. So I use the example of Changhua in Taiwan, where they literally had the government did not have the infrastructure to provide the necessary renewable power for their massive data center campus out there. And so Google ended up building some of the world's largest floating photovoltaic cells. But not only have they done that, so of course they've energized the Taiwan renewables industry, but they've also not interfering with on an island where there is a huge demand for space, because of course they've done it, and actually they've done it on fish farms. So it's actually increased the aquaculture yields of those fish farms because now the fish have got more shelter. So I think that, and also the other thing that people forget when they think about what data centers, yes, they're energy hungry, but how much more energy would be used if, let's say, the three of us got in our cars and met up for a coffee, in London. This is the thing that, it's a false equivalence if people don't factor in how else you would have done your business. And I think that's something that, needs to be kind of given more credence. But certainly, if we're thinking that it's single digit, potentially into double digit territory in terms of the power consumed, and all of that power is renewable, and it's reducing the need to jump on a plane or jump in the car. I do think that there is a strong case that data centers are a force for good when it comes to sustainability. The big challenge is it's very easy for Google to design their own data centers to be completely sustainable and have lots of nice green initiatives. Because if they screw up, it's their problem, it's their own fault. The problem is with wholesale colo is they've got almost like they're always being asked like two competing things. One is like, we want it to be stable and we want it to be reliable and predictable. And the other is we want it to be nice and green and we want it to have lots and lots of renewable initiatives. Well, given that we're going from a less green to a more green world, the less green world and the less green technologies are all well understood and they're reliable. And everyone knows that a marine diesel that was designed to start on a ship, in high seas in the middle of a storm is predictable because people, people's lives are quite literally dependent on it. But they are dirty and polluting, and they're not a long-term sustainable solution. So what are you going to do? You're going to now go to, well, gas turbines would be a good interim. I mean, they're used in Asia a lot instead of diesel generators, but also, fuel cells, things like that. But of course, when the customers come along and they've got their tick box of the level of resilience, and they're like, oh, this uses a innovative, electrical design, and innovative equals risky. So how are you going to do that? And in my view, what the customers need to be doing is being more supportive of the data center operators, shall we say, not taking more risks, but being more proactive with designs which are more sustainable. So turning around and saying, we're moving from a combination of UPS and generators to we're moving to removing our generators altogether and just having massively increasing the amount of UPS. That's one strategy, perfectly legitimate strategy. You've got another strategy that says that you can take your UPS and your generators and you can actually be part of the smart grid. So you have a lot of kit which is capable of generating and regulating power. And we are increasingly creating sustainable schemes like solar and wind, which are intermittent. And so someone's got to say, well, hang on a sec, like this is an opportunity to, I think multi-grid was a scheme that I can't remember whether, how far they've progressed, where they had this idea that they would not only, as a data center operator, export their heat, but they would also connect into the local grid to try and stabilize the smart grid, and doing all sorts of things to kind of promote their green credentials and to be kind of a positive forces in this sort of sustainable future. So it's a really interesting area, and I think there's a couple of ways that you can do it. One is that customers can pressure them, but of course customers always want, the guy who's doing procurement is always going to get it in the neck if he chooses someone who, they have an outage. And I suppose the other one is that, governments can legislate. Like if it's a level playing field and everyone who builds new data centers in, say, Germany is required to export their heat where reasonably possible, then that's fine, because everyone who's playing in that field is working under the same rules. And Google is going to continue to take space in Germany, and Microsoft will, and Nvidia will, and all of these other users of space will continue to use it, and they will just understand that yes, there is a new architecture that is coming in, but at the same time that new architecture is required for all data centers, so you're not in any additional risk by choosing that. And the same thing there, if you could legislate to say that you can use data center generators and UPS for dynamic, FFR, whatever it is called, the grid stabilization technologies. And of course, that also presents itself with a potential additional income stream for the data center operators. Because if you're not using a generator and you're not using UPS, then 99% of the time it's sitting there doing nothing, and it's cost you, millions to put in place.
And do you think, you mentioned obviously possible government intervention. At the very highest level, we all spend all our well, not all of it, but as digital consumption, whether it's taking pictures of, the dog on the walk, another 10 today and another 10 tomorrow. Do you think at some point governments need to have a conversation or explain to consumers that, to just carry on consuming data, digital space that has a cost to it? And because I know, I worked in the storage industry, for example, and they were all being under pressure to provide all the hyperscalers, with loads of storage for free that they could give to their customers. And clearly now people pay maybe a bit, but it's still very free to have lots of digital information in the cloud, I guess. Do you think at some point there'll be a readjustment so people actually will pay the right price and begin to understand this balance between, consumption and sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I was just looking at I had the notification from Apple that I was, going off their 79p a month storage plan, and I was going into a £2.50 one. And, £2.50 is what I pay for a coffee. And yet I was still kind of humming and hawing about whether or not I should, I should change it up or not, or whether I should start deleting photos. So I think there is definitely an element of, it's like, oh, why do I have to pay this? It's like a toll for me. But I also think that if you're looking at should we say the waste that emails and images and things like that aggregate over time, I think it's pretty minimal compared to the waste of, say, when you buy a coffee that's non-disposable cup or something like that. You consider that it's a relatively small footprint, and I think it would be kind of going after the wrong target, perhaps, if you were to go after that, compared to, there is a lot of smart solutions that are already being found in order to, whether it's compression techniques or, ways that data can be more efficiently handled, in terms of the storage and it's not endless, but I do think that it's relatively minor compared to what you would say the main issues with the consumption in our world.
And just quickly, in terms of the actual data center sort of community, clearly there are a lot of data centers that are fairly old. Have you got any handle on how many of those are capable of being upgraded to these sort of sustainable facilities we've been talking about? Or is there a requirement potentially for a fairly substantial replacement building program? Because most of those, I'm thinking of, telecoms had old-fashioned data centers that you'd probably be horrified to look at even today. Whether or not those can be rescued or not. Do you have any sort of ideas on what level of replacement as opposed to refurb is required?
Yeah, it's funny because when you consider what an old telecoms data center was, it's a glorified switch room next to a large population hub that feeds out. It's the perfect candidate for an edge data center. It's where everyone gets their broadband hooked up into. What you get a lot of is these old legacy, systems integrators, managed service provider operations, which, had a 20-year contract to provide, payment services for a company or something like that. And their leases or their contracts are all coming to an end, and they have these assets that are sort of sitting there. There are companies now that are going around buying up those for sort of, a discounted rate, and looking to kind of reconfigure and make use of the underutilization. I mean, we all know that, banking data centers, for example, are the ones that were built sort of between, say, 2005 and kind of 2012. The vast majority of them were never more than 50% utilized. There's a huge amount of spare capacity there that could come on stream, but of course, accounting being what it is, you have issues with, oh, well, we can't sell it because the book value is that high, and it doesn't matter that this thing is very inefficient by comparison. That's always is always a bit of a challenge. But it makes a lot of sense to make use of what's there. I mean, just going to talk about the sustainability. It's make, do, and mend. Like, if you've got something where 60% of the kits can be repurposed, without requiring you to build a new, multi-megawatt data center, then it would make sense to do that. It already has the connectivity in place. The challenge normally is on the companies who are in occupation there, that they need to have the courage to and the confidence that they can actually part with this is exactly the same story about why people were hesitant about colo in the first place. Was like, well, I want someone else looking after my kit, and this is my my critical equipment. But yeah, I think it's an important area that is a limited way of getting some additional capacity into the market. But if we look at the overall situation right now, there is in Europe, across EMEA, there's about 5,000 megawatts of built data center space that we've tracked so far, and we're tracking about over 1,000 megawatts of space which is currently under construction, and about another 3,500 megawatts that is in committed phase developments. So 20% of all the space, of all the space that's ever been built in the last 30 years, there is another 20% more capacity landing in the next year or so. That is an astonishing growth. And in the next 5 years, that's going to be more like, kind of another 80% of everything that's been built. So yes, you can repurpose some, but I don't think it's going to be the end solution. I think we're going to see a continued sustained increase in demand overall. And that would be a matter of, shall we say, eking out some opportunities for someone to get into a market quickly. The other advantage which you get if you buy into a legacy data center, especially if you can keep your customer there, is that it gives you that first customer. And if you're a data center operator, it's the hardest thing is to get that first customer over the line, because I always say, like, data centers are like hospitals. Like, who's going to a hospital that's never treated someone before? would you, I mean, it doesn't matter how shiny that MRI machine is. Like, if there's a hospital down the road that's treated thousands of people and you know them all and they're, very happy with it. Like, so if you can get that first patient who happens to live in the hospital, but is also a patient, then, then you can sort of say with a straight face that you've treated people.
Actually, just to that point, you mentioned earlier, there's potentially new money because commercial properties, office blocks are, if not empty, there's only going to be change in terms of use. Is there a danger? Do you think that some of this new money will be unsophisticated, so that whether it's your shiny new, do the people try? Do you think most of these people will be responsible, etc., or do you think there'll be a few people that think, oh, it's just build 4 walls and a roof, chuck a bit of power in, off we go? Or do you think most of them do understand that it's not quite as easy as that?
I mean, we're getting a lot of inquiries from non-traditional data center investors, and part of what we are having to do is spend a long time educating them on sort of the basics of, yes, it's an asset class of real estate, but no, it's not the same as as an office block. You can't just find an office and you can't just find it. I mean, they use it that very infrequently you'll get single asset sales of data centers. Traditionally, there'll be sale and leasebacks of a banking data center or something like that. But it is very, very infrequent. They are the exception, not the rule. So when someone comes along and they say, I've got a $400 million fund and I want to buy a data center, you're like, well, you're better off buying a data center operator company. But again, if you turn around now, like they're probably not short of requests for investment right now. So, they can be a little bit picky about it, shall we say. And then so at that point you have to say, well, what are other markets where we potentially could buy into that don't have that weight of everyone trying to get, into the market? And so, if someone has a bit of appetite, I mean, what I thought was really interesting was, Goldman Sachs with their GC infrastructure, new company that started up, and the first company that they bought was not, I don't know, Pulsant or IOMart in the UK. It was Atman in Warsaw, and I think that's a really interesting thing that that these more institutional type investors are have a willingness to go into those markets now, rather than just because buying a single asset data center now is like, well, okay, so are you going to be an operator? Because you buy the asset, but now you're going to have to keep the generators and the lights on and the security going, and it's not just like buying an office and then collecting a rent check every quarter.
We covered a substantial amount of ground. Are there any sort of other key points to make, or have we sort of done most things?
No, I think that covers a kind of good area. I think from my side, I'm going to be interested to see how we've seen this wave of public cloud commitments go out, in 2019 and 20. We haven't yet seen the kind of plans of, and that's primarily from the US kind of hyperscalers. And what's really interesting me at the moment is how the likes of Alibaba and Tencent, the Chinese hyperscalers are going to be approaching it, whether or not there's going to almost be a kind of, like a territorial element to it in terms of, well, the Chinese hyperscalers got presence in Europe, yes, but they haven't started building hyperscale facilities in the same way that the American ones have. In the Middle East and Africa, well, that's a different matter. There's seeing a lot of activity around there. And where is that kind of lines going to be drawn? And also, are there going to be the same commitments, on ESG and things like that from the Chinese hyperscalers, so that everyone is, kind of completely on an even keel? Or and then, of course, you have the political elements as well. So I think that is a really interesting story to see kind of how it develops, over, how far the US is going to go east and how far the Asian hyperscalers are going to go west, I guess.